So this story is in two parts. So the king and the queen and the young man went off in search of the old woman that the young man who had given the young man the green box with the pearl in it. In the meantime, back at the house where the old woman was, she put another log on the fire. And she called her daughter over, and they went and spun for a while. They sat at their spinning wheels and spun just quietly, just as people who've known each other a long time don't need to talk. They just can work together. They spun quietly until it began to get dark. And then there was a whir of wings, and at the window, this sound, woo-hoo, 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 woo-hoo. And the old woman said, "Daughter, that's the time for you to go and take your evening walk." So the daughter bowed her head, she stood up, she put on her wrap, and out she went and walked. And she walked over the meadow and through the hills until she came to a place where there was a spring, and there were 3 oak trees surrounding the spring. And she sat by the spring and did the strangest thing. She took the skin off her face and put it in the spring and rinsed it and hung it up on a rock. And then she took the gray wig off her hair. And when she did that, her beauty shone through. This was no longer the ugly daughter of the old woman. This was a beautiful young princess, and she had eyes that shone like the stars. She had cheeks that were as pink as apple blossoms, and she started crying. And when she started crying, out came pearls and precious gems. She wept bitterly. And then all of a sudden she heard a crack in a branch overhead, and that scared her. She quickly picked up her skin, put it back on her face, put on her wig, and ran off. She ran off, and she ran back home. And she ran back and ran in the door and said, "Mother, mother, you wouldn't believe what just happened." And the old woman said, I know. You don't need to tell me. But you know, now it's time to clean the house." And the daughter said, "Clean the house now? We cleaned it during the day." And the old woman said, No. This is time to clean house. Make it spick and span. Here, take a broom and help me." And so they worked together. And then the old woman said, "Today is the day you are going to leave." And the daughter began to cry, and she said, "But I don't want to leave you." And the old woman looked at her and said, "You don't know what today is. 3 years ago you came to me." And the daughter interrupted and said, "Yes, and I've worked hard, and I've loved being with you, and you've treated me well." Yes, said the old woman, "but today is the day you must leave." And the daughter said, "Where will I go? What will happen to me?" And the old woman said, "Trust me, your wages will be good. You will find a lovely new house. Just trust me. Right now, go up to your room, put on the silk dress you were wearing on the day I met you, and just wait." And the girl ran up to her room and changed into her silk dress. Now, in the meantime, we remember the king and the queen and the young man had gone off to find the old woman and her hut. And they wandered for a day. They ended up getting split up at some point. And so the king and queen were together, and the young man were together. And the young man walked the whole day until it became dark, and he climbed up in a tree. He climbed up in a tree, thinking maybe he'd spend the night there, at least wild animals wouldn't get him. And then he saw a figure walking across the heath. And as the figure got closer, he saw it was the daughter of the old woman, the ugly daughter of the old woman with the gray hair. And he went, "Great, I'm going to catch her. She'll tell me where that old witch is, and we'll get to the bottom of this." And he was about to climb down the tree, and then he watched her and saw that she went down to the spring, and he watched her more, and he saw her take the skin off her face and take her wig off. And when she did that, he didn't believe it. He held his breath. There before him was a beautiful, beautiful young lady with eyes that shone like starbeams and cheeks that were the color of apple blossoms and beautiful hair covering all of her. He held his breath, but he must have leaned over a little bit too far because a branch cracked. And when the girl heard that, As you know, as I told before, she put her skin back on, her hair, and ran off, just like a deer would run off when they hear a shot of a gun. Anyhow, he climbed down quickly from the tree and started rushing after her, and he came across the king and queen who were crossing a meadow. And they looked at him and they said, "Did you see anything?" And he said, "Well, the strangest thing, I just saw the old woman's daughter, who was really ugly, but she took the skin off her face, and it was a beautiful young woman." And he described her, and they said, "That must be our daughter. That must be our daughter. Let's go in the direction that she went off in." And so they went with him, and they walked and walked until they came up to the small house. And the king and the queen and the young man looked in the windows, and all they could see was the old woman bent over the fire, and the place looked very, very clean. And the geese came squawking up to them, but then walked away. Very strange. And finally the king said, "We must knock on the door, gather ourselves." So they went up and knocked on the door, and the old woman opened the door and said, "Come in, come in." And they walked in, and the king said, "We are looking—" "I know what you're looking for," said the old woman. "I know, and it never would have come to this if you didn't have such a terrible temper, if you treated your daughter as all human beings should be treated. But you've suffered enough. I know you've suffered for 3 years. And your daughter, in the meantime, has stayed with me. She's been well cared for. She's been loved. Her heart has remained pure. She knows how to work, too. She's a very kind girl." And the king said, But where is she?" And the old woman said, "Daughter, you can come down now." And she called up the stairs, and the daughter rushed down the stairs in the dress she was wearing, without her skin on her face, on the day that she was found. And the king and queen just, "It's you!" And they hugged, and the daughter cried tears of pearls and precious stones. And the young man stood back looking. He was amazed at how beautiful she was. And at one point she looked up at him, and her face turned a little red, and she didn't know why. And then they turned to the old woman, and they said to her, "Thank you for taking care of our daughter." And she said, "It was my pleasure. She's very kind. And I have a gift for her." And she brought forward a box, and she said, "In this box are all the pearls and jewels that you wept for the 3 years you were with me. With this, you will always be wealthy. You won't need a kingdom." And the king said, "Yeah, I can't give her my kingdom because I gave it to the other 2 daughters." And the old woman said, "She won't need it. She will be plenty wealthy. And she will always have a house to stay in." And in that moment when the old woman said she will always have a house to stay in, all of a sudden the old woman disappeared. Poof! And right around her, the house shook. And then it went poof. And instead of the small old cabin there was a magnificent castle. And there were, if you looked around, there were servants scurrying around. There was food being put on the table. And in the distance you could hear the old woman saying, "And I give my house to you, my daughter, for 3 years." Well, they didn't find the old woman. In fact, my grandmother, who tells the story, has a bad memory, so she doesn't quite finish the story. But I'm guessing that those geese turned into the serving girls, and they waited on the princess. And I'm also guessing that the princess and the count married and lived very happily in that castle. And I'm also guessing that the old woman wasn't a witch, but she was a wise woman. And on the name day for the princess, she gave her the gift of crying pearls and precious stones, and she was the one who looked after her when she was exiled for 3 years. And we can imagine that the princess and the count, the young man, they lived happily ever after, and the king and the queen got to visit them regularly. And the name of the story is The Goose Girl at the Spring. By the way, you can always listen to the story more than once, or listen to part 1 and listen to part 2 later. Yep, and it's my pleasure to tell it to you. Till next time.